the Identity Theft Resource Center, if you've never heard of them, you need to know about them. This is a great organization and one of the, if not the first, and if not the oldest and longest organization dedicated to fighting identity theft and working with identity theft victims. Well, today is the episode that you definitely want to tune into because I have a very special guest. So stay tuned to find out more. Welcome to the Carrie Kursky Show, your partner in the fight against identity theft, fraud, and cyber threats. I'm your host, Carrie Kursky. Well, welcome to today's show. I have, like I said, I have a very special guest today. Joining me is Eva Velasquez. She is the CEO of the Identity Theft Resource Center. So Eva, thanks so much for taking time to be on the show today.
Oh, I'm delighted to be here. Thanks, Carrie.
So Eva, tell everybody that's not familiar with the Identity Theft Resource Center, what is it and what do you all do?
So we are a 501c3 nonprofit organization, and our mission is to empower and guide all stakeholders, so consumers, victims, government, and businesses to minimize risk and to mitigate the impact of identity crimes and compromise. And it's pretty broad. That's a broad mission statement. Mm-hmm. If I boil it down, really at the heart, at the core is our victim services. So many people will have these experiences with the misuse of their identity credentials, like a social security number, an experience with a cybercrime, scam, whether it's on the phone, online. All of those things are tied in and touch our lives. They're just all intertwined with our daily lives, and people need a place to turn. So we provide those free services, whether it's actual recovery services, I'm a victim and I need help, or they've been touched by the issue or exposed to it in some way. They had a friend who was a victim. They saw a newspaper article and they say, I want more information. How do I minimize my risk? What can I personally do? So we will give them that tailored plan. There is no one size fits all. Really depends on how you engage in the outside world. And so that we will listen to who they are and how they live and say, here are the things that are going to give you the biggest benefit for the least amount of your time investment. And then, of course, we do definitely try to work with businesses and government to get them to both make changes, acknowledge best practices, and do things that will ultimately, in the end, help consumers and victims.
Yeah, and your organization is very well needed and very much appreciated for people like myself, because there are so many victims, so many different instances that are happening. The bad guys are constantly upping their game, changing their MO. So as soon as we think we've got a handle on it, they throw us another curveball. So the more people out there that can help victims and also help the businesses try to put things in place on the beginning, I think that's great. Now, a couple of the things that with your organization, I know that every year you do a data breach report where you keep track of reported data breaches. So tell us a little bit about that.
Well, we've been tracking publicly reported data breaches in the US since 2005. And what started as we just need to follow this problem to better inform our own recovery and remediation services turned into this program in and of itself. So this is the 16th year that we've issued that report. We just dropped it a couple of weeks ago. And interestingly, I think probably the most interesting trend is that actual data breaches are down. They are down year over year. There were less breaches in 2020 than there were in 2019. At first, people were kind of breathing a sigh of relief and saying, well, that's good news. But big caveat here,
right?
There were still over 300 million individuals impacted in breaches in 2020.
Wow.
So it's not over yet. It's not time to breathe a sigh of relief. And the shift in how the criminals, the threat actors are behaving, we don't know if this is a long-term trend or if it's just a blip on the radar, because 2020 was such an unusual year.
Right.
There were so many opportunities for the thieves to monetize the data they already had through the IRS stimulus and economic relief fraud, the SBA loan fraud, the state unemployment benefits identity theft. There were just all of these very lucrative opportunities as we kept throwing buckets of relief money into these different programs. And so the thieves were actually busy using the data that was already out there. They didn't need to go and hoover up more data. Now we'll see. At some point, they're going to have to refresh that data to beat the fraud analytics that are out there. And we'll see when that happens. Our prediction is that this won't be a long-term trend and that we're going to steadily see breaches just continue to drop. They may drop slowly, but they're going to continue to happen on a massive scale. I think we've just become sort of desensitized to it. We go, oh, it's only 1,000 breaches, only 300 million records.
Right.
Well, that's better than last year. And
Right.
you go, yeah, but it's still terrible.
Yeah. Well, and I have people too that they'll say, you know, when I'm out speaking, I'll say, okay, how many of you received, you know, one breach notification, 2 letters, 3 letters, 4 letters? And people are like, oh, I don't even pay attention to them anymore. So yes, we have become immune to them. Now,
Yeah,
even
breach
though the
fatigue is real. It's
Yes.
absolutely real.
Absolutely. And even though the bad guys, they had all this information, because just like any other business during the pandemic, they had to pivot, find other ways to make money. And like you said, they used what they already had and they were creative with it. So let's talk about maybe some of the mistakes that were made with these programs that enabled the bad guys to be able to take advantage of it. Because I know, you know, through our office here, we've seen an unprecedented amount of calls from victims from unemployment, from the SBA, from the PPP, EIDL, you know, things that we've never even saw before, or if we did, not to this magnitude. So let's talk about what are some of the problems that could have led to this.
This may be overly generous, but I'll just call it the factors that led to this. Because actually, and truthfully, mistakes, it's kind of open to interpretation, because there were some things that I can actually say this was a mistake. And that is the antiquated infrastructure. So for case study purposes, let's talk about unemployment identity theft. And just to level set for your listeners, so that occurs when someone other than you has access to your identity credentials that are needed to apply for unemployment benefits. So there were a number of factors that went into the explosion that we saw in 2020. The biggest mistake was not something that happened in 2020, but something that's been happening for years beforehand. And that was this lack of investment in good cybersecurity practices and an infrastructure. At the beginning of the pandemic, we had 16 states who were still running their systems on COBOL. Okay. For people who aren't coders, that's a really, really old system.
Really old.
And so we failed it was very short-term thinking. It's too expensive for us to change this out, to upgrade it. So we'll just take this old system and we'll put some new software on top of it. And we just keep adding these things on top of it. They don't necessarily work well together. So that's mistake number one. Mistake number two was that the fraud analytics and the authentication processes that we had in place, those are expensive. They cost money.
Right.
And many states decided that either they weren't going to deploy them at all because they didn't see the need, or if they had previously deployed them, they got rid of them. And I'm talking about before the pandemic.
Wow.
It just was very hard for them to see, we're making this investment and spending these dollars, and what are we getting in return? I don't see any fraud. Well, yeah, you're not seeing the level of fraud because the program's working.
Right, it works. Don't fix, you can't fix what's not broken.
It's sort of like the Maytag repairman. You know, yes. I have this well-built machine and it doesn't break down and it doesn't need service. And so what am I paying for? That's what you're paying for.
Exactly.
So there's a little bit of short-term thinking. Now, I won't call these mistakes, I'll just call them factors that went into making this very appealing to the thieves, was frankly the amount of money put into the system. Unemployment identity theft has always been around. In 2019, the ITRC received 19 calls on the issue in the entire year. Wow. So it's really easy to remember, 19 and 19.
Right.
And that trend historically was about the average. Starting in March, we saw this tremendous, it was like a hockey stick of the number of calls going up. And we're getting 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 10 a day. And the team knew immediately, this is super weird. This just doesn't happen. To date, so from April through today, we've had well over 1,000 calls on the issue, well over 1,000. I can't even do in my head what that percentage increase is. It's something like 5,000% increase in the number of cases for this particular issue. So the capacity and the ability for the thieves to do this, if they had the correct identity credentials, has been around. It wasn't all that lucrative. It was an awful lot of work for a small return.
Right.
Well, now we have put this extra $600 a week into that system. That makes it more lucrative. And as a reaction to the pandemic, we lowered and removed a lot of the barriers for authentication.
Yep.
And I am willing to listen to the argument that many people have made. And I, we'll figure out where we land here, but the argument that we should have a slightly higher fraud tolerance because we want to get this money into the hands of the legitimate users. There's always going to be a level of fraud in these systems. We know that.
Right.
We want to keep it as low as possible. But when it comes to helping people, should we increase that tolerance slightly? That's an argument that some people, I shouldn't even say argument, discussion that some people are having. And I'm willing to listen to that and ferret that out. What is the tolerance level when you have people who have this immediate need? However, what ended up happening was the tolerance level was escalated to the point where the legitimate users couldn't get in.
Exactly.
The people with the legitimate need had been beaten to the application process by the thieves. And so now it has had the opposite effect of what was intended. We want to lower these thresholds. You don't have to come in person. You don't have to provide this data to authenticate who you are, because we want to get this money in the hands of people who need it. Great intent.
Right.
The unintended consequence of that was that the thieves got in there first, got the money, and now you have massive, massive, massive numbers of people trying to report this fraud. And while they're waiting for these completely overwhelmed state systems to unwind the fraud, they still don't have any benefits that they need to live on. Yep. It is the biggest problem, in my opinion. Others may argue differently, but in my opinion,
I agree 100%.
The biggest problem in the fraud space that we faced from the pandemic last year.
And, with the SBA programs, you had the PPP and the EIDL, same thing, where when you lessen the requirements or the verifications to expedite getting the funds distributed, the bad guys swoop right in. They didn't even check, because at first you could only apply for them with your bank where you currently do business with. Okay, so that takes out some of that, extra need for verification, because you do business with them, they know you're established. Then they opened it up to any bank could do it. Then they opened up to the virtual online banks that don't even have brick and mortars. So we're dealing with tons of victims who we can't even contact these so-called virtual banks because there isn't a branch that you can walk into. And the only thing you can do is use their chat online. And it's like, you're talking to a computer and there's no human factor, and it just, regurgitates the same ridiculous answers. So I agree. That was a huge problem. I understand the need and why they intended, the intention for it, but it just opened.
The execution fell short. It did not work the way we thought it would. And very similar IRS, the stimulus.
Oh yes.
And relief dollars. Very similar issues with that not working properly and going into the wrong accounts. And we really, on that one, we saw the gamut of both online, high tech digital and analog crime, because it was anything from they've gone in, they've taken over my account that I had and changed the account where the money is deposited into, to I know the check was on its way. I got the snapshot from my, mail delivery service, and now it's not here. So it was just physically stolen from the mailbox. So
wow.
the fraud really ran across the entire spectrum in that case. It was with the state unemployment, that was for the most part a digital,
right,
IT problem. But there were some other issues with people having the cards, receiving cards in other people's name at their address. And the thieves they were more local fraud rings, trying to get the mail, trying to get it directly from the
Right.
the postal carrier, looking at the MLS list to see what homes were on sale, thinking they'd be vacant and they'd just be able to go in and get the mail.
Yeah.
So they
You know,
were
one
very sophisticated when they looked at how can we pull off these schemes.
Absolutely. You know, one of the shifts that we saw, because with the tax return filing deadline being pushed back, instead of being April, they pushed it to October. So that a lot of people delayed, which gave the bad guys even more opportunities to file the fraudulent ones. But after the October deadline, we started getting calls from people where when they filed their return, they found out their dependent had been claimed on someone else's return. So the bad guys were just filing these and they were adding dependents that were not even theirs, because the more dependents you have, the more money you received. So that was
Yep.
another trend that we started seeing too. Yeah.
Well, I guess we'll get on the doom and gloom bus before we get to the good news.
Right.
The unemployment identity theft issue, one, it's not over. It's still happening every day. And two, now that we're looking at tax time and we're looking at people filing their returns, and it has already started. We were talking about this back in November, that we saw the writing on the wall. And in fact, we have been working with the IRS. We let them know what we were seeing. And they do now have information and advice up on their website. But people are going to go to file their taxes. It may go off without a hitch. They'll feel like they have done I'm done for the year. I don't have to revisit this. And then the states will be sending out the 1099-Gs. Those are that's the income for those unemployment benefits. Those benefits are considered taxable income. So there will be victims who do not even know that they were victims, because maybe it was in another state, not the one they reside in. And they will then get a notification from the IRS saying, you failed to report that income. And now we have to do this audit. It's already happening.
Yep.
We just started this process and we are getting calls in the call center from people going, I just got a 1099-G from this state where I don't have any income from there. I never applied for these benefits.
Right.
And the biggest challenge is that they have to go back to the state. There's only one pathway to resolution, and that is reporting it to the state. And the state systems are still unable to get to the legitimate requests that they have, legitimate unemployment filings that they have. They can't even begin to get to the fraud issues.
Oh yeah, no.
So it's going to take a long time.
It is. We're telling people that, you know, most of the state systems, you just have to fill out an online form or you send an email to a specific email address to report it. And I'm telling everybody, expect a response in probably 3 to 6 months, because that's how long it could take.
I think that's reasonable. For
some of the people, what we're having them do, and again, some of this is just kind of trial and error because there's so much of it and it's so different. The ones who've received the 1099-Gs, and even though they notified the state, but they haven't had any confirmation or anything back from the state to find out if it's been resolved or not, we're also having them file the identity theft affidavit, the IRS identity theft affidavit. So that way, at least kind of gives the IRS a heads up of saying, hey, I'm a victim of identity theft. Somebody used it for unemployment purposes. So that way they can at least, you know, file their tax return and there's some record of it with the IRS that they've tried to report it to them. So again, you know, not quite sure how effective that's going to be, but we're just trying to look for anywhere where we can kind of cover some bases until the victims can hear back from these states.
From the states. We're encouraging people to file the FTC affidavit so that they have a record of it. The IRS themselves has said, please don't fill out the identity theft affidavit form, the IRS one, unless you have actually been a victim of someone has filed a fraudulent tax return in your name, not just for the receipt of the 1099. Now, that is the process they're asking the public to use, mainly because I believe they need the state to address the initial fraud. So I think that they need to come out with more guidance, and we're actually trying to work with them to get them to come out with more guidance. Our advice has been, go ahead, document. I mean, I think that's universal. You're telling everybody the same thing, document, and get the FTC affidavit. It is more universal. It can't be used in every single incident and everywhere, but it can be used in a lot of places. And so you then have that document that demonstrates, hey, this is when I notified the federal government, the Federal Trade Commission, that I had this issue, 6 months ago. So I told you guys this, and then you document, what you did, so that if something does come up 5, 6, 10 months later,
Mhm.
you can demonstrate that I was a victim of a crime and I have the documentation going back. I didn't just make this decision because I didn't want to claim this income,
Right.
to say that. I actually reported this
Yeah.
months and months and months ago.
And on the identity theft affidavit from the IRS, there are two check boxes. So there's one to check if you are a victim of tax return identity theft. And the other one is if you're a victim of identity theft, not related to a tax return, but it could increase the risk of a tax issue. So that's why we're having them do that, is they're having them check that second box and
check
send
that
it off.
second box then.
Exactly.
Check that
Again,
second box.
We're just trying to kind of figure this all out, because there's no roadmap. There's no instructions of how to deal with this, because there's so much of it and it is so new, and it's going to take a while, like you said.
I don't think
everybody
we're
comes
the
out with
only ones trying to
instructions.
figure it out, though, Carrie.
Right.
I think even the people in charge of resolving the issue are
Mhm.
figuring this out as they go along.
Exactly.
So, yes, check that second box.
Yes.
And, I can understand I want them to be on notice. I think the advice that they're giving of not to do that, I think, is so that they don't get overwhelmed.
Well, I agree.
So,
yeah.
But
No,
we have to
I
balance
understand
this
all
with
that.
the
Yep.
needs of the people who are filing these. I get that.
Right.
People, hey, listeners,
I know.
we're trying. We are
Exactly.
trying to get the right resources. And, at the end of the day, the feedback that we've been giving to our federal partners is, please just develop a uniform process.
Yes.
And please develop a uniform process that takes into account that you're going to have outliers, that not everything is going to work as it's supposed to, as we want it to. And
Right.
you have to have something to address that, because there are going to be a lot of people where a lot of these transactions took place online, but they aren't engaged online. They don't have access to or can't make effective use of the internet. So giving someone who is a victim these platforms and saying, well, the crime occurred online, so you must know how to use it. It's like, no, it wasn't me.
Right.
I don't even have a smartphone or an email.
Mhm.
And we need to stop leaving people out.
Right.
And make sure that these things are accessible to everyone. And so that's another big piece that we're trying to make sure they're being thoughtful about as they develop these processes.
One of the things I want to touch on too is you guys came out with a report, I forget how many years ago, but talking about the psychological impacts of identity theft on victims. And I know, working with victims for 15 years, you can recognize what stage the victim is in based on when they first call you. And I believe it was the Department of Justice who said that, and this was years ago, saying that victims of identity theft go through the same emotional response as a victim of a violent crime. So when you all came out with your study, I thought it was phenomenal, because people don't realize the impact. Most people think, oh, it's just a compromised credit card, it was no big deal. It's not. Out of all the years I've been doing this, I've actually had 2 victims who ended up committing suicide over it because of the emotional turmoil they had to deal with. So can you touch that on a little bit about it?
Absolutely. So what you're talking about is our aftermath report. And we've actually been doing the aftermath report since 2003. And this is where we survey the folks that we helped in a previous year. So we talk to the victims that we assisted, and we ask them a series of, we go much deeper than how much time did you spend and how much money did you lose. We ask them about the emotional impact. We ask them about the behavioral impact. How did you behave and how did those behaviors change? We ask them about relationships. How did it impact your family life, your work life, your employment? We ask about the physical, things like headaches, insomnia, nausea, all of those reported by victims. And when BJS put out their study, I believe the one you're talking about is the 2016 study, where they were able to draw these close parallels between victims of identity theft and financial crimes having the same level of emotional distress as victims of simple assault. I think that was the category, but it was a violent crime category.
Right.
And it's really been our mission for years to try to flip that narrative of it's no big deal. It's
Mhm.
just your money. It's just your finances. It's no big deal. And, to the point that you're making, we will be releasing this year's study in May.
Oh, good.
And just a little trend analysis for your listeners. The two of the most startling things to me are the re-victimization rates. They're increasing at a tremendous clip.
Mhm.
Whereas the previous study, we had 21% of respondents reporting that they had previously been a victim of identity theft. This year's study, it's 28%.
Wow.
It's a pretty big increase. And then the other piece that was very startling to me was the feelings of suicidality, feeling suicidal. We've always had a small number of respondents report to us that they felt suicidal over the
Mhm.
years, 3%, 5%. I think one year it was 6%. This was the first year that it was in the double digits. It was full
Wow.
10%.
Wow.
10. I really, people that are listening, I really want you to sit back and reflect on that. Consider that this was such a significant and impactful problem that 10% of the people that responded to our survey actually felt like their only option was to end their life, that
Mhm.
was the only way to resolve this issue. And it was that overwhelming. I, I think we need to do more stepping back and letting that sink in
Right.
so that we understand that this is, maybe you had an experience where it was an existing credit card and it wasn't that big of a deal and you're having a hard time relating, but it can be so much more than that. And it can
Yes.
stop people from it, it can stop them from having a home, having a roof over their head, having
Mhm.
employment, pursuing educational goals. There are so many different types of consequences, and it can be years long.
Right.
It's not just, oh, I had a bad week.
Right. No, no.
People can lose life opportunities. How do we measure those costs in dollars? Because that's how we like to measure everything. What was the financial impact? Well, there's more than just a financial impact.
Exactly.
And that's what the aftermath, that's why it exists and what we hope to explain.
Yeah, and I so appreciate that you do that because again, people they have no idea of the impact, And when I got the phone call about those two victims,
Oh,
I wasn't even expecting to get this. I'm like, what do you mean? What just happened? But some people, it just becomes all consuming. And the other thing too, comparing it to a simple assault or violent crime, this one, I don't want to say that it's worse because in those you have the physical harm and you do have, a lot of the psychological impact. But when it comes to identity theft, you're dealing with a ghost. People are fearful because they don't know who did it, if it was somebody in their community, if it was somebody on the other side of the world, and they don't know if that person's going to show up at their house. They don't know if they're going to bring them physical harm. So you have been violated by a ghost. And for some people, that's very hard to deal with.
and you probably realize that it could happen again.
Hmm.
And that is actually a similar feeling to violent crime victims. If you've been assaulted out in public, that feeling of this could happen to me again. And so I am so anxious and scared. When is it going to happen? Those feelings are similar to,
Right.
to your point. I don't know where this person is. I don't know if they live in the same block as me or across the ocean, and you probably never know. So there's also this lack of resolution that just, it's in perpetuity. It's just never resolved. You never know who did it. You never know if they were brought to justice, and you just have to protect yourself. That creates a mindset that, again,
Hmm.
very anxiety and kind of ready for the other shoe to fall. And that's an unhealthy way to live.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's talk about what are some of the things that you want to share with listeners. I could say, give us some tips about how to protect themselves, and we could spend the next 3 weeks talking about these. So just kind of, I guess, narrow it down to some of the big things that you're seeing, and what are some quick, simple steps that people can do to help protect themselves.
I'll narrow it down to two things just for brevity's sake. The first one, as far as concrete actions, please freeze your credit. Just please freeze your credit. It's free. It doesn't take that long. The process actually has become more streamlined. I was talking to a journalist actually, who said, okay, I'm finally going to do it. I actually took the day off. I am going to make this the priority. I'm going to do it for myself and my kids. And then she got back to me later. She goes, it took me 45 minutes to do all three.
Right.
And I said, yeah, I knew you didn't need to take a day off. It's a cumbersome process, but it's not that overwhelming.
Exactly.
It's not a panacea. It is not going to protect you from everything. In fact, truth be told, it would not have made any difference in the unemployment identity theft and the government benefits identity theft that we saw skyrocket last year. But that doesn't mean it doesn't have tremendous value. It really will keep another person who has access to your identity credentials from opening new accounts in your name. It is a very good proactive step to take. So please do that. And then the second thing that I will say is, please don't be embarrassed or ashamed to seek out help.
Right.
We carry so much of the shame stigma if we don't understand how cybersecurity works, or this piece of technology, or this particular scam. I almost fell for this scam, or I did. And I don't even want to say fell for this scam. That's even pejorative.
Right.
You were lied to. You were
Right.
lied to, and you believe that. And that is okay. That doesn't make you gullible or dumb.
Right.
You know, this is a very complicated space. There are professionals out there who day in and day out, this is what they do. If you fell and broke your leg, you wouldn't expect yourself, and nobody else would be like, you know what, Carrie, you should just set that yourself. You should know how to take care of that,
Sure.
put that cast on, and be able to do that yourself. Nobody would say that to you. You would go to a professional, you would get the help that you need, you would follow the advice, and then you would, kind of move on with your life. It's the same thing. Seek help from a professional. They can help you. And there are plenty of free resources out there. Of course, I'm going to mention the Identity Theft Resource Center. We're out there. We're available. You can call us on our toll-free number. You can live chat with us. You can SMS, text to chat with us. You can DM us on social media. You can send it by carrier pigeon. Any way you want to get in touch with us, please go ahead and get in touch with us. And then, of course, there's the Federal Trade Commission. There's the Cybercrime Support Network. There are so many good free resources out there that can help you. And then, of course, some of these things get to the point where you need legal assistance, or you really actually do need a dedicated advocate, people like you, Carrie. So if that's the case, seek that out and don't be ashamed or embarrassed. It's not worthy of that. And two, it can happen to anybody. It can happen to absolutely anybody. So get the help you need.
Well, thank you for saying that, because there is a lot of stigma when this happens to people, because they think it's something that they did. And especially when I see with a lot of our seniors, when their children find out, they tend to, so what, you can't handle your finances anymore? I can't believe you fell for this. Well, let me take over all your accounts. I'll just manage it for you. That is the wrong thing to do.
Absolutely.
The wrong thing to do. People make mistakes. Everybody makes mistakes. Nobody's perfect. So you need to create an environment where if somebody comes to you seeking help or seeking guidance, don't make fun of them. Don't belittle them. Help them. I mean, that's what they need.
And don't take it over. I completely
Yes.
agree with what you're saying, especially when we're talking about our parents. Now, my mom is almost 80, and I would never, when she comes to me with questions and things, I never look at that and go, I need to take over.
Right.
You can no longer manage your own life or finances. That is the wrong reaction. It's, let me help you with that. I'm glad you're asking. And that it's this self-perpetuating cycle. If you are open to those conversations and realize that this can happen to anybody, and we need to be in this together, helping each other, then they're going to come back and ask more questions and double check more often and not try to manage it on their own. Conversely, if your reaction is, I can't believe you fell for that, and you're no longer competent, do you think they're going to ask questions next time something comes up, or are they going to try to figure it out on their own?
Exactly.
You're going to have the opposite effect than what you want.
Yeah, yeah, no, I agree. So one more thing I want to talk about. I know that your organization had put an article out, a timeline, trying to remember, maybe it was a couple months ago, but talking about how a lot of the government or even statewide funding for programs such as yours, there are a lot of cuts. Which can have a huge negative impact because victims need to have resources, places that they can go. Can you talk on about that a little bit?
Absolutely. And we did put that out back in November. I'm very pleased to say that we are no longer the only ones talking about that issue. The state attorneys general is actually also talking about the issue.
Good.
And we are seeing more organizations kind of taking a look at the state of resources and funding for white collar fraud, identity based, and cybercrime. So, I mean, that's a very broad category, but the majority of funding for victims of crime goes to violent crime victims. And I'm not going to argue that that
Right.
shouldn't be that way, but there's almost nothing. It's virtually nothing for fraud victims, for identity-based crime victims. And to the point where the last grant funding from the Department of Justice Office of Victims of Crime that was dedicated to identity theft victims was offered back in 2016.
Wow.
And prior to that, it was a program that was started in 2010. So they offered it in 2010 and 2016. It's an afterthought. And what has been happening with the VOCA fund, which is the Victims of Crime Act fund, is not a taxpayer dollar funded fund. It's dollars from things like forfeited federal bail bonds and penalties and asset forfeiture and things like that. So it's actually the criminals contributing to this fund so that you can help victims.
That's great.
And the dollar amounts that they've been releasing to help victims has gone steadily down over the years. In 2019, it was 2.3 billion. Last year, it was 1.8 billion. I know that sounds like a lot. People go, well, still 1.8 billion. This is for the whole country. It's for every state, every nonprofit, every victim services organization in the entire country for every type of crime. And the vast, vast, vast majority of it went to the states in the form of block grants. And then there's this little tiny bit that's left for nonprofit organizations like mine. And I fully admit I have a dog in this fight. I absolutely have a dog in this fight. Those are called discretionary grants. In 2019, there was 344 million in discretionary grants. Last year, it was 144 million or 148. I might be I'm doing this off the top of my head. It was less than half.
Right.
It was cut in half. And again, the vast majority of those were for programs for violent crime victims, and none of it for victims of this ever growing identity cyber fraud problem. And we have to change this, because
Absolutely.
if we don't, the only options for people will be paid services.
Right.
There won't be any free services available to help people with this. And that'll mean that they don't have anywhere to go if they don't have the disposable income to pay for it. That's the wrong direction.
Absolutely.
The thieves would love that. The thieves would absolutely love that. That's not where we want to go, though.
Oh, yeah, because identity theft does not discriminate. It can happen to anyone, regardless of your income, your gender, where you live. It doesn't matter who you are. It can hit anyone at any time. Where, a lot of the other financial crimes are going after people who have the funds that they can steal from. Identity theft doesn't matter.
No, your true financial picture is completely irrelevant. It's your credentials that have value. And just to wrap it up and give an example so people can really wrap their brains around this. I did have someone, a victim or a consumer, say to me, my credit is terrible. My financial picture is just terrible. They can have my identity. What do I care? And I said, no, that's actually the wrong attitude.
Right.
Because what about payday loans? And the consumer said, well, yeah, but I would never get a payday loan. Those are like 25% interest. So I said, yeah, but a thief doesn't care.
Right.
They don't care.
They're not paying it back.
They can still monetize your credentials by going through maybe you would never use them, but your legitimate picture and how you would behave, irrelevant. They're just
Right.
going to go monetize them. And that their eyes got really big and they were like, I never thought of that. It's like, yeah, maybe we want to pay attention and start thinking about, freezing our credit, even though you think it's irrelevant because your credit is so bad.
Right.
That was another notion. Well, why should I freeze my credit? My credit's so bad. It's like, you could probably get credit. It's just going to be at a terrible interest rate, but
Right.
the thief doesn't care.
Right. Yeah. And it's all, I tell people you can't block all identity theft from happening because it's impossible. And they always find new ways to be creative. But the more barriers you can put in place to make your identity difficult to use, the goal is to make it so difficult, they move on to maybe another target. And I know the ultimate goal is to eradicate all of this, but that right now there's not possible. So you need to protect yourself and make yourself difficult to use, a difficult target.
Yeah, we just always say, don't be the low hanging fruit. The thieves love the
Exactly.
low hanging fruit. So don't let it be you. Put some of those barriers in place and just make it a little too much trouble. So they'll move on. Kind of like having a dog.
Yeah.
I'll have the dog barking in the house. So the burglar moves on to the house without the dog. It's kind of the same principle.
Yeah, I always say make yourself less attractive than your neighbor. So kind of the same thing.
Yep. Yep.
Well, Eva, I want to thank you so much for joining us today. You are a wealth of information. I love talking to you. And listeners, if you haven't had a chance to check out their website, I highly recommend it. There's so much information on there. They have a lot of great sample letters, templates, things that you can use. They're a huge resource that if you've never looked into it, go ahead and do it. And in the show notes and in the link below, we'll have the link to their website. So that's it for today's episode. I really appreciate you joining us, and tune in next week where we will continue to talk about how to protect yourself from identity theft, fraud, and cyber threats. Until then, stay safe.